In my last video, I shot this panorama and I covered off some of the techniques that I think are important when shooting a panorama. In this video, I want to talk about those techniques in a bit more detail and cover off why they're important. And I also wanted to show you a little bit of how I processed that final image. I hope you'll enjoy the video. If you do and you're not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing. And if you are a subscriber, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Hi everyone, thank you for joining me again. In my last video, I was out by the side of the local marina or the local port, and I shot this large panorama. And during the course of that video, I showed and in some cases talked about some of the techniques that I think are important when you're out shooting a panorama to maximize the success of getting that panorama to work when you get it back onto the computer and ending up with an image that works. In this video, I wanted to go through some of those techniques in a bit more detail and cover off the why. So why is it important to do some of these things and what effect does it have? And I also wanted to just show you how I stitched the panorama and a little bit about how I processed it. I'm not going to go through the entire processing workflow because it would take ages with a file that size. But I thought I'd just cover off some of the details on it. So the first thing I need to cover off is actually an inaccuracy or an error in the first video. I put up that this was a 12-shot panorama, and it's not. It's a 15-shot panorama. I don't know where I got 12 from. I just miscounted somewhere along the line. It's a 15-shot panorama, although it's been cropped in a little bit, so it's probably closer to 13 by the time you take into account the cropping that I did. In terms of the techniques that I used, the first thing I talked about was leveling both the tripod and the camera. And I wanted to talk about why that's important. Now obviously leveling the camera, getting the horizon level in the scene is important in pretty much any landscape image. But if you're shooting a panorama and you've got an uneven horizon, a horizon that's leaning to one side or the other, when you stitch it together you're going to have loads and loads of leaning horizons, and it might actually cause some problems with the stitching process. To be honest, Lightroom and Photoshop and other software is pretty good at determining any sort of unevenness in that and correcting for it. But even so, if you get it nice and level, that's better. So I guess leveling the camera is pretty obvious. So why is it important when you're shooting a panorama to have the tripod level as well as the camera? And if you think about this, if you look at shooting a panorama, your camera is sitting upright. Most panoramas are shot vertical. Doesn't have to be, but most of them are. And you're rotating the camera and taking shots at various points on the way through. If your tripod is leaning over and your camera is then tilted up to compensate for that, when you actually shoot, you're kind of doing this, so your camera is actually kind of twisting as you shoot the pano. And what that's going to mean is that your final image is going to be kind of all wobbly. Again, the software is pretty good at compensating for that, and what you'll find is the middle of the pano will be fine, but the top, bottom and ends of it will kind of be all like this and wobbly, and you'll waste a lot of space. Now you can get away with it, you can crop in a bit tighter and get rid of that space, or you can use, depending on what the scene is, you can use things like content aware fill to fill in the gaps. And you can even use the warp tool in Lightroom when you're creating the panorama. But all of those things create some degree of distortion or lack of quality in the image. But if you get your tripod upright so that that rotation is right the way through the middle, then you don't have that problem. And when I come to show you the actual stitch of the panorama, I'll show you what I mean by that. So the next technique I showed was the fact that I was shooting with manual exposure. And this is important because the light from one side of my scene to the other was very different. It was much brighter on the left hand side of the scene than it was on the right hand side. And if I'd been shooting in aperture priority mode or any of the automatic modes, my camera would have adjusted for that. Now in some ways that might sound like it's a good thing, because it would sound like I would get a balanced exposure across the scene, but in reality what would happen is that I would get a significantly different exposure, and therefore when it joins them together you kind of get bands, particularly if you've got a blue sky. It's even worse with a blue sky. You get kind of tonal shadowy bands running down the sky where the two images are overlapping or joined together, but they're not the same exposure, and that can look absolutely horrible, and it can be almost impossible to get rid of in post-processing. So manual exposure is the way to go for panoramas, in my opinion. The next thing I put in was manual focus. Now, to be fair, it doesn't actually have to be manual focus, but the focus should be locked to the same focal distance for every single shot. If you're just using normal autofocus, then there's a possibility that as you swing the camera around and take different shots, the focus point could change. So you might be focusing on the far distance on the scene on the left, and you might be focusing at a different point on the scene on the right. And that could cause some problems. In particular, you can get something called focus breathing, where the apparent focal length changes very slightly depending on where you're focusing in the scene. So what you actually might find is that the apparent focal length of the left hand side of the scene and the right hand side of the scene is different, and again that can cause huge problems with the stitching process and just make the image look weird. So the way to do this is either use manual focus, as I did, or you can autofocus and then switch to manual focus once your focus point is locked in, if you don't like using manual focus. Or, as I often recommend to people who prefer not to use pure manual focus, activate back button focus on your camera. Therefore you press the button, get it to focus, and then from that point on it doesn't change until you press the button again. But manual focus, or locking your focus in so that it's the same all the way through the range, is really important. Exposure set, focus is set, camera's level, tripod's level, time to take the shots. I always shoot my panoramas with a wider field of view than I need for the final image. So that means I allow myself some space, top and bottom, and when I come to start and finish the panorama, I start earlier than I need. In other words, I have more space on the left hand side or the starting side of the image, and likewise I finish later than I need, so I'm allowing more space on the right hand side. You can shoot them the other way around, right to left. For some reason I always shoot left to right, or nearly always, but the idea is leave yourself some space to crop in afterwards. And then it's just a case of taking the shots. I allow an overlap of 1/3 of the frame from shot to shot, and if in doubt I err on the side of allowing a little bit more. I would prefer to have a 1/2 overlap than not have enough and the image fails to stitch, because that can be a real pain. Once I'm actually started shooting, it's just a case of take a shot. I used the 2-second timer in this one to take the shot, wait until it's finished, turn the camera till I've got roughly 1/3 overlap on the frame, wait for it to settle, press the button again, another 2-second delay while the timer kicks in, take the shot and move on. Obviously in this one every shot was taking 5 seconds as well, so it was taking probably 10 seconds per frame by the time I was shooting, turning the camera, waiting, shooting again. It was probably 10 seconds per frame. And then right at the end, what I did was I took another image which was basically the same as the final frame of the panorama. I did it with my finger in front of the lens. And the reason that I do that is it's just a reminder, so that when I get it back into Lightroom I know where the end of the panorama is. And if I'm out doing lots and lots of shooting and the panorama is just one image among loads that I'm doing, I'll quite often start my panorama by shooting a frame with the finger pointing the other way so that I know which direction everything's going in. So my sequence might go shot of my finger in front of the frame pointing, you know, left to right, first shot, second shot, third shot, fourth shot, fifth shot, however many shots, and then one at the end pointing back in again. Just makes it easy when it comes to do the processing. Okay, so I had my images captured, I got them back onto the computer, got them into Lightroom, and then it was time to merge them. I did a very simple process, selected all 15 images, right click, photo merge, panorama, and then it's just a case of waiting for Lightroom to do its thing. Now I will say that a 15 frame 36 megapixel per frame panorama is quite big, and my computer is getting a bit old, so it took a while to process. But eventually what you get is a preview. So I had the settings on cylindrical rather than on any of the others. I never use perspective. I've never yet found a use for perspective. And I generally find cylindrical gives me a better option than spherical. I don't have the auto crop or auto settings turned on. I can apply a little bit of boundary warp, which will fill in some of the gaps around the edge, but you can see there's not a lot of gap around the edge here, and that's because I spent time getting everything nice and level. But a little bit of boundary warp just to correct it a little bit, but you don't really need it because I know I'm going to crop this image down anyway. And then it was just a case of click on merge and wait a while for Lightroom to do its thing. I won't do that now because it did take a while to do. So this is the image basically straight after the photo merge. It's not been cropped, it's not been processed in any way. I'm not going to run through all of the processing steps in detail because, as I said, it's a big pano and my computer's a bit slow and it would take a very long time to actually replicate all of the steps. But I'll just talk you through briefly what I did on this. So in terms of the basic process, I didn't do too much global adjustments, but I was quite extreme with the highlights and shadows. I pulled the highlights all the way down and the shadows all the way up because the scene was very, very contrasty. I boosted the overall exposure by about a third of a stop. I put in some vibrance and I added a bit of saturation, which I don't often do, but I did feel this image could cope with that. I also cooled the image down by bringing the colour temperature slider down in the white balance settings, and I took some of the magenta out of the scene by bringing the tint down a bit more into the green. Because the image was darker on the right hand side than on the left hand side, I used a grad filter on the right hand side of the frame, bringing up the shadows and boosting the exposure a little bit just to help balance it. And if I actually put the mask on, you can see where that filter is affecting. And then just to balance it a bit more, I put another filter over on the right hand side of the frame, which was just basically pulling the highlights down. And again, if I turn on the mask, you can see where that's affecting. And then I added a graduated filter into the sky, basically making the top of the sky bluer than it had been previously. Again, I really wanted cool tones in both the water and in the sky. So if I put the mask on, you can see where that's affecting. And then I cropped it, and the final crop is something like about 3.15 to 1 or something like that. It's a pretty wide, very short image, but it's not a ridiculous format that would be completely unusable. So I quite like this. I just took out some of the edges and a bit out of the top and bottom, and that was pretty much it for the image. Although I did actually take it into Photoshop and I just very slightly adjusted the angle of the reflection of the tower, just because I felt it looked better straightened up a little bit. Now I said that this image, some of the boats were a little bit blurry because with a 5-second exposure some of them were, got a bit of motion blur because they were moving around even though it was pretty calm. In fact, most of them are pretty sharp. There's not that much movement in there. But over on the far right hand side, which is kind of an unsheltered part of the port, there's some more noticeable movement and blur in a couple of the boats, but I don't think it's a problem from a point of view of the image. Likewise, some of the masts have got a little tiny bit of motion blur in as well, but again, I really don't think it matters that much. You can only really see it if you zoom in, and even with a fairly large print I don't think you would notice that amount of blur in there. So that's it. I hope you found that interesting. If you have, and if you've enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or a share or both, and don't forget about the subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber. I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know what you think about the process, ask me some questions, whatever you like. Leave me a comment. I love to get comments. And finally, as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch, so thank you very much. And until the next video, bye.